The next major issue deals with homelessness, and this connects in with the issue of crime. I read through all the comments, and what came up repeatedly was particularly women feeling less safe because they were harassed on the streets by people who they saw as homeless people. What is your sense of what the city, what the state can do on the issue of homelessness? They acknowledge that we need to take care of the homelessness. They are part of our community, but at the same time, there is a sense of less security. We're going to rotate this.
We're rotating. First, I would say we have to continue to be a compassionate society, obviously, that tries to help people. We have to address the housing issues in our city, which have really skyrocketed in cost. And I think in this last legislative session, again, with finally having a Democratic Senate, we were able to do that. So many people here may have been involved in the issues around rent control and rent stabilization. We obviously put a package together that really strengthened tenants' rights and tenants' ability to stay in their apartments. So we need to do more. Obviously, in many ways, the affordable housing issue is frustrating. There's an area mean income that makes it unaffordable for many people. So there's these complicated formulas that come from the federal government. We need to address that so that the answer isn't just the developer goes up 5 more stories or 15 more stories so that you can pay $1,900 for a studio under the area mean income. So it's definitely something that I believe Albany will continue to focus on in this coming year and try to have some answers to. Now, on the issue of the homeless shelters, it is very problematic and very difficult to cite them, especially when the city continues to have very, very large shelters. So, for example, in Dutch Kills, we've had a continuing problem. We tried to work with the group, it's women, but anytime we go to an advisory board meeting, they'll say things like, how many 911 calls in a month? And they'll say 600. And I'm like, no, not the precinct, the address. And they'll say, no, that is for the address. So that can't be the answer. These groups get big money to run shelters, and they have to be able to work with the people there so that we're not calling 911 and throwing it to the EMS, every 2 minutes, or to the police department every 2 minutes. So it is a problem, and to pretend that it's not is to pretend. And so we don't do that here. We try to be realistic. We're trying to work to get these things smaller. At this point, our community has done its fair share. We have a number of hotels that house people who are working. We need to do more in the mental health field. I mean, the issues go on and on. So whatever we can do locally, if there are concerns about people kind of gathering and if they're inebriated or under the influence of drugs, we want to handle it in a multi-approach way, not just in the police way, but in a way that perhaps delivers mental health services and other things. But it is problematical. It's not easy. Certainly hasn't been easy in the Dutch Kills community to work with that program. And it's been a frustration for us with the providers who are getting a lot of money to run these things and don't always run them well. So the city we did put a lot of money in the budget, and I'm sure Jimmy will speak to that, but I have with me a lot of data about what the Assembly advanced in its budget for human services, and some of them include things that I've worked on as education chair, like after school and things like that, but that's not really about the homeless, so we'll wait for that for later. But we do spend hundreds of millions of dollars in our city and state, and we need to get a better return, and we need to provide more help for people so that, yes, everyone can feel safe, and also that people can stay in their own homes. That would be the best way, and prevent homelessness that then leads to other problems.
So the homelessness crisis in the city is a multi-pronged crisis, right? It is an affordability crisis. It is a mental health crisis. It is, for many, a substance abuse crisis that drives people out of secure housing and onto the streets and/or seeking permanent shelter. I want to reiterate what the Assemblywoman said, which is that in a compassionate, humane society, we should treat those less fortunate than us with compassion and with humanity. And homeless individuals are human beings, first and foremost. That does not mean that Mayor de Blasio's sightings of shelters is fair or equitable, or that the process works. I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is that we have to think about this as an affordability crisis, a mental health crisis, a substance abuse crisis. The folks that we see in shelter, by and large, are people who have hit rock bottom and who are desperately searching for a way to get off the streets and into a place where they and their children can survive. That is the nature of what we are dealing with. The folks that we see on the streets are in many ways even worse off. And I know that we see homeless individuals living on the streets in our community sometimes, right? A lot of people know him as a change man, right? The man who often asks for change outside of Dunkin' Donuts or on Queens Boulevard in front of our office. He has a name. We know his name because my office has tried to help him dozens and dozens of times. My staff is here, Deborah Tharrington, the director of our constituent services operation. We try, and we will continue to try, to help Mr. Davis off the streets of Sunnyside and into permanent shelter, into the treatment that he desperately needs, because I don't believe that the life I see him living on Queens Boulevard is a life that we would want any human being to live. So we're trying to both get those folks who are homeless on the street, suffering with those real human issues, the help that they need. And then when it comes to shelters, we certainly have to do better. Blissville in particular saw an unfair burden placed upon it. But all of us have an obligation to make sure that we're part of the solution of homelessness. All of us have an obligation to treat people humanely. And if you go into the shelters, as I have, and speak to the young women who predominantly live in most of them, with their young children, they will tell you that I've escaped a domestic violence situation, right? That we were in a basement, but the mold was going to kill my children, and I needed a place to go. We need, as a society, to make sure that we are actually reaching out and providing a hand up to those folks, not demonizing or vilifying them. I'll just say also that the council, the state, certainly has done some really great work in terms of making sure that people can continue to live and afford their apartments. The council a few years ago put in the funding to make sure that every person who's attempting to be evicted, because we have an eviction crisis as well, has a lawyer representing them. They have the ability to fight against landlords who are trying to evict them. All of that is part of what we're dealing with. All of that to say we've done some good work. We have a lot to do. But first and foremost, we have to see homeless individuals as human beings and as people who also are a part of our community.
So what you're hearing up here, I think, is that the homelessness problem is really an intersectional problem. It involves mental health issues, it involves substance abuse, it involves domestic violence. I can't get into all that in the 2 minutes, but first and foremost, I think it involves housing affordability. That's probably the one thing that is most directly impactful on the homelessness crisis that we have. You heard the Assemblywoman and Jimmy both mention this. We have done incredible work this year with the new majorities in the Senate and our partners in the Assembly to tackle one prong of the problem, which is keeping people in their homes who were getting evicted at an incredibly awful rate when the rent laws were not really protecting tenants, but were providing landlords with a way, an easier way to get people out of their homes. We have a lot of activists here who I've worked with. Nilda Rivera is sitting right up here in front from Cosmopolitan Apartments, who are dealing with the problem that is ongoing on this issue. But we now have the strongest tenant protections we have ever had in New York because of the work we did just this past year. Harder to evict people, harder to use some of these loopholes to raise rents. The financing model for a lot of developers was to actually purchase a home and value it based on how many people they could evict in a certain number of years. So when they were getting their loans, the amount of loan they would get, the amount of return they were expecting was actually based on how many people can we kick out of their homes in the next 5 years because we could raise the rents and make that much more money. So we put a big, we stopped that process from happening the way it was. The next big part of the problem is actually creating more affordable units. So you got to keep people in the homes that they are, but then also create affordability, because gentrification is surging in our communities probably more than anywhere else in the city right now. And we've got to figure out a way to put a stop to it. The luxury developments are just going up everywhere. Rents are going up everywhere, and people are getting priced out. The city's done some good work to try and build what they call affordable units, but how they define affordability comes down to be the problem. So yes, if someone wants to come and they insist on, is it 30% now, Jimmy? It's somewhere in that ballpark, depending. They insist on a certain percentage of a new development being affordable, then the question becomes how you define affordability. Brian Barnwell and I know Kathy's been supportive, have been trying to figure out how to solve that puzzle. A couple of years back, we came up with the idea, don't base the affordability metric on the region, because that's what they usually do, because that includes Manhattan, it includes Westchester and Long Island, and creates a measurement that's way too high. The problem we have now is we are actually very expensive. So if we base it on our own zip codes, we are pricing ourselves higher. So we've got to figure out a new way to try and solve the problem. But the housing issue, both keeping people in their homes and creating new units for regular people to live in, will go a long way towards solving it. I will also say that the shelter system in this city is broken. The way they site these places is broken. The people who run them, as Kathy said, are often not doing what they need to do. They don't tell the community as they need to, when they're coming, where they're coming, and why they're coming. Oftentimes I've seen situations where we have had better ideas of where to put a shelter. So we wouldn't even be saying no, we just say put it over here where it would be less disruptive to everyone, including the residents of the shelter. And the city just pushes ahead and does what it wants anyway. So we also have to solve that siting problem in terms of the shelters.
I know we're keeping it to a timetable, but I should have mentioned, as Mike just did, that we have a bill to have a community advisory board for every shelter. For over 35 years, we've had a shelter on Borden Avenue that had very little community problems because we had an advisory board. Unfortunately, the city has moved away from that, and it's not the right approach. Community advisory boards are like the the canary. They find out if things are being run well. They give the organizations that run these shelters feedback. Obviously, it's a big time commitment to ask people, but many of our local business people in the past have done it. And I think whether it's Blissville, Dutch Kills, the ones on Queens Boulevard, all of them, if there was a community advisory board commitment on the part of the city and these nonprofits, would help solve some of these problems, because then you'd be in a position to say, I see a man on 46th Street, what can we do to help? So we're going to keep pushing that bill. We have Senate sponsorship. We're going to keep moving forward. Thank you.